Welcome to True Crime Cases, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature, where everyone knew each other. Remy lived a seemingly ordinary life with her husband Thomas. On the outside, they appeared like any other couple, friendly, polite, and always keeping up appearances, but beneath this, Remy was hiding a secret that could change everything. She had recently started seeing someone else, a mysterious man named Rowan. This wasn't some innocent friendship Remy was drawn to. Rowan in a way she had never felt before. She kept this relationship hidden from everyone, knowing how it would shock the town and devastate Thomas. But Remy's heart was conflicted. She loved Thomas, or so she believed, but there was something thrilling about Rowan that she couldn't resist. Thomas was a hard worker and loved Remy deeply. He believed their life together was strong, although he had started noticing small changes in her. She seemed distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else, and often made excuses to be away from home. But Thomas goes to trust Remy after all. He couldn't imagine a life without her yet. They couldn't shake a growing worry that something was off. Then there was Rowan, the newcomer to their town. He had arrived just a few months ago, and while people noticed him, they didn't know much about him. He was tall with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. Rowan was charming, but in a way that left people feeling a little uneasy. He was bold, a risk-taker, and didn't seem to care about the rules everyone else followed. To Remy, Rowan was everything exciting, everything different. He spoke to her in ways that made her feel alive, like he was the only one who understood her desires and dreams. Rowan knew exactly how to make Remy feel special, and he used this to pull her further away from Thomas. Despite her feelings, Remy knew she was playing with fire. She would tell herself to stop seeing Rowan, to go back to being the loyal wife she was before. But it was as if Rowan had a pull on her she couldn't escape. Each time she met him, her fears would dissolve, replaced by the thrill of being with him. He encouraged her to think of herself, to live a life she truly wanted. But his intentions weren't as innocent as they seemed. Rowan wasn't just interested in Remy. He wanted Harold to himself, and he didn't care about Thomas or the chaos that might follow. Meanwhile, Remy's sneaky trips to meet Rowan were becoming harder to hide in a town. This small people noticed things. Some of her friends started asking questions. Why are you out so late? Why didn't Thomas come to the gathering? Remy laughed off the questions, pretending everything was fine. But the town was beginning to buzz with quiet gossip, and if Thomas heard even a bit of this talk, she knew her life would never be the same. Rowan, however, found the situation amusing. He loved the idea that they were sneaking around, almost daring someone to catch them to him. This was all part of the thrill. One evening while Thomas was at work, Remy met Rowan in a small diner on the edge of town. They sat in a booth at the back, talking in hushed voices. "How long do you think you can keep this up?" Rowan asked, smirking. "Aren't you worried Thomas will find out?" Remy swallowed, feeling the weight of the risk she was taking, but Rowan's words excited her. Even as they scared her, she tried to shake it off, saying, "I can handle it. Thomas trusts me." But even she didn't fully believe her own words. As they left the diner, Rowan held her hand tightly, giving her a look that said he wanted more than just stolen moments. "I want you to myself," he whispered, his eyes serious. "You know this can't go on forever." A chill ran down Remy's spine. Part of her knew Rowan was right, but the thought of making a choice terrified her. She wasn't ready to break up with Thomas, and yet she didn't want to let Rowan go. She wanted to keep things exactly as they were, even though deep down she knew it was impossible. Back at home, Thomas was starting to piece things together. He noticed that Remy's stories didn't always match up. She'd say she was with friends, yet those friends hadn't seen her in days. She'd say she went shopping, but he couldn't see any new purchases. These little lies began to pile up, and Thomas's unease grew. He didn't want to believe that Remy could betray him, but the signs were there, nagging at him, no matter how much he tried to ignore them. Sometimes he would catch Remy looking out the window, lost in thought, or checking her phone, quickly hiding it when he entered the room. These moments, though small, were like tiny cracks in the trust he held so dear. Remy's double life was starting to slip bit by bit, and Thomas's suspicions were growing. She was playing a dangerous game, balancing between two lives, two men in her mind. She could keep it all hidden, keep both men happy. But the small town whispers were getting louder, and the walls of her secret life were closing in. Remy's life grew more tangled as her relationship with Rowan deepened. The sneaky meetings, the secret phone calls, and the thrill of keeping it all hidden made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt for years. But with each day keeping her double life a secret became harder. She was now in too deep with Rowan to simply walk away, yet each time she was with him, something felt different, a bit darker. The more time they spent together, the more Remy realized that Rowan wasn't just charming, he was intense and at times controlling. Rowan wasn't satisfied with their stolen moments in empty diners or hidden spots. He started pressuring Remy to spend more time with him and kept urging her to leave Thomas for good. "He doesn't see you for who you are," Rowan would say, his eyes dark and unwavering. "With me, you can have the life you've always wanted." While these words filled Remy with excitement, they also brought a new kind of worry. Rowan was no longer just the exciting escape from her normal life. He was starting to demand all of her attention and didn't like it when she tried to pull back. Meanwhile, Thomas could sense the distance growing between them. He would try to spend more time with Remy, planning small dinners or suggesting weekend getaways, but she always seemed distracted. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Thomas looked over at Remy, his face full of concern. "Remy, is everything okay with us? You've been so distant lately," he said softly, reaching for her hand. Remy forced a smile and brushed it off, saying she was just tired and busy. But Thomas didn't look convinced. He wasn't the type to snoop, but he knew something wasn't right. His gut told him that Remy was hiding something, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. As the days went on, Thomas's suspicions grew. He started noticing little things like how she would quickly silence her phone when he entered the room, or how she'd leave the house at odd hours, making vague excuses about meeting friends. Thomas decided he couldn't just ignore these signs any longer. He needed answers, even if he was afraid of what he might find. One evening, when Remy was supposed to be out meeting friends, Thomas decided to drive around town to clear his head. As he passed by the small diner on the edge of town, his heart sank there. Through the window, he spotted Remy and Rowan sitting together in a corner booth. They were laughing, leaning close to each other, completely absorbed in their own world. Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. As watched, he felt a painful twist in his chest. The betrayal was right there in front of him, and it felt like a punch to the gut. That night, Thomas didn't confront Remy right away. He waited until she got home, her face flushed with the thrill of her evening, clearly not expecting him to be awake. She tried to sneak quietly into the house, but Thomas was sitting in the living room waiting. "So how was your night out with friends?" he asked, his voice calm but strained. Remy froze, realizing that something was wrong. She could see the hurt in Thomas's eyes, and for a moment, guilt washed over her. "Fine," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. But Thomas's gaze didn't waver. He stood up, his jaw tight. "You know, I saw you tonight at the diner with him." There was a heavy silence. As Remy's face went pale, she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Thomas shook his head, his voice trembling. "After everything, this is what I mean to you feeling cornered." Remy finally admitted it. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Thomas. I was unhappy, and Rowan, he made me feel something different." Her words only made Thomas's pain deeper. He walked out of the room, leaving Remy alone with her guilt and shame. But this wasn't the end of things. It was only the beginning of the storm that was about to hit. Rowan didn't know Thomas had found out, and Remy didn't tell him. She was afraid of how he'd react, especially as she was already becoming more possessive. He started texting her, constantly asking her where she was and who she was with. At first, Remy thought it was sweet, a sign that he cared. But soon his messages started feeling more like demands. He would show up unexpectedly, insisting she come with him even when she had other plans. Growing angry if she tried to pull away. One afternoon, Remy tried to tell Rowan that she needed some space. "I don't know if this is what I want," she said, her voice trembling as she looked at him. But Rowan's face darkened and his hand gripped her arm. "Don't you dare pull away now, Remy," he whispered, his voice cold. "Your mind, you don't get to leave." She pulled her arm away, fear flickering in her eyes. She didn't know Rowan could be like this, so harsh, so unyielding. The thrill she once felt around him began to vanish, replaced by a growing sense of dread. As her life spiraled out of control, Remy felt trapped between the two men. Thomas was heartbroken and angry, struggling to make sense of their relationship. Meanwhile, Rowan was becoming more possessive, refusing to let her go. She didn't know what to do. Every decision felt like it would hurt someone, and she was caught in a web of her own making now, with Thomas's suspicion turning into anger and Rowan's affection becoming a dangerous obsession. Remy realized she was no longer in control. The life she had carefully built was on the verge of collapsing, and she couldn't see any way out after that painful night when Thomas confronted Remy. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. He had loved her deeply, and now the person he trusted most had kept such a huge secret from him. The pain was mixed with anger, and he found himself wanting to understand everything that had happened. Thomas couldn't let it go. He needed to know the truth. Thomas started watching Remy more closely. He'd check her phone when she left it out, hoping to catch some sign of what was really going on, and sure enough, there were messages from Rowan, long intent and messages where he talked about their future together and urged her to leave Thomas. Each message was like a fresh wound for Thomas. It hurt to know that while he'd been trying to save their marriage, she was sharing her heart with someone else. One afternoon, Thomas followed Remy. He didn't want to be the kind of person who snooped, but his pain and curiosity pushed him forward as he quietly tailed her car. He felt a strange mixture of guilt and determination. Remy drove out to the edge of town to a park that was mostly empty during the day. Thomas parked a short away and watched from his car. Soon, he saw Rowan pull up and Remy went over to him. They hugged, and the sight crushed Thomas. It felt like he was watching a life he thought was his fall apart in front of him. Later that night, Thomas couldn't hold it in any longer. When Remy returned home, he confronted her again. "I saw you with him today." "Remy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going?" And Remy's face paled as she realized there was no way to hide it anymore. She tried to explain, saying she had felt lonely, that things between them had changed, but her words only deepened. Thomas's hurt feeling cornered. Remy tried to apologize, saying she'd end things. With Rowan, she wanted to save her family, to fix what was broken. But her words felt empty to Thomas, and he told her he needed time to think. For days, they barely spoke, each avoiding the other around the house. Meanwhile, Rowan was becoming impatient. He didn't want Remy to keep living this double life, and he didn't want to be her SE secretary anymore. He started pressuring her, texting her constantly, saying things like, "When will you finally leave him? And I'm tired of waiting." At first, Remy tried to calm him, telling him she just needed a bit more time, but Rowan's messages grew more intense and his tone shifted, becoming darker. It was as if he felt entitled to her now, like he couldn't handle the idea of losing her own evening. Remy met Rowan at the park to talk things over. She told him she was scared of breaking her family apart and that maybe things had gone too far. But Rowan wouldn't listen. "You're just afraid," he said, his voice sharp and accusing. "You don't love him. You love me. Why are you still holding onto something that's already broken?" Remy felt trapped. Rowan's gaze was intense, his words pushing her further away from the life she had with Thomas. She didn't know how to explain her fear of losing everything she'd built with her husband. But Rowan wasn't interested in her reasons. He wanted her, and he was determined to have her no matter what. As Remy struggled to make a decision, she felt the weight of her double life bearing down on her. At home, Thomas had grown colder, more distant, and she could feel his trust slipping away with every passing day. Her heart was torn between two worlds, but neither seemed to offer her peace. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her family. But each time she tried to pull away from Rowan, he would remind her of everything. She told him every secret she'd shared, making it feel impossible to just walk away. One night, Rowan pushed Remy even harder, saying, "Why are you letting him hold you back? You're not happy there." He leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. "It's time to choose, Remy, me or him, but if you don't decide, I will." His words sent a chill down her spine. She realized then that Rowan was more controlling than she had ever thought. The man she had once seen as thrilling and mysterious now felt like a storm she couldn't escape. Feeling more trapped than ever, Remy returned home that night with her heart pounding. Not sure what to do, she lay awake, wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. Her choices were limited, and every path seemed to lead to someone getting hurt. She feared Rowan would go to any length to keep her in his life. But leaving Thomas felt just as frightening. The betrayal had already scarred their marriage, and Remy knew she had broken Thomas's heart, yet he was her family, her safe place, something Rowan could never truly replace. As the days passed, the tension in her life continued to build, and Remy felt like she was living on the edge of a breaking point. She was torn between fear of Rowan's hold over her and guilt over what she had done to Thomas. It was as if her whole life was balancing on a fragile thread, and she was terrified of what might happen if that thread snapped. Rowan was growing tired of waiting in his mind. Remy was the only thing that mattered, and he didn't care about them as it might create. One evening as they met secretly in the park, Rowan took Remy's hands in his and looked straight into her eyes, his gaze intense and unflinching. "Remy," he whispered, "you know there's only one way for us to be together without him standing in the way." Remy felt her heart race. She didn't want to believe what Rowan was suggesting, but the look in his eyes made everything clear. You can't mean that," she stammered, pulling her hands away, but Rowan held her gaze, nodding slowly. "Think about it, Aya," he insisted. "You told me yourself that he doesn't understand you, that he's keeping you from living the life you want. If he wasn't in the picture, we could finally be together. No more sneaking around, no more hiding." The words hung heavy in the air, and Remy couldn't shake them. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, on step away from something she couldn't come back from. Part of her knew this was wrong, so terribly wrong. But another part, the part that had grown tired of living a double life, felt an eerie sense of relief. It was like Rowan was offering her a way out, even if it was a twisted one. But Remy was still hesitant. I can't just do that, Rowan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thomas is my husband. I know we're struggling, but he's not a bad person. Things got complicated." She buried her face in her hands, feeling the weight of her choices crushing her. But Rowan didn't give up. Over the next few days, Rowan continued to pressure her. He painted pictures of a life they could have together, traveling, living freely, no more lies. "All it takes is one decision, Remy," he'd say, his voice low and persuasive. "Don't you want that life with me?" As Rowan's words echoed in her mind, Remy's behavior became increasingly erratic. She was distant at home, avoiding Thomas's questions and acting as if she was constantly on edge. Thomas noticed the changes and grew even more suspicious, but he couldn't figure out what was going on. It was like Remy was someone else entirely, someone he didn't recognize. Rowan's grip on Remy grew tighter, and she felt like she couldn't breathe. He wouldn't stop pushing, wouldn't stop planting ideas in her head. Soon she found herself thinking about it more often, wondering if somehow, some way, she could make this choice and have it all disappear. The thought terrified her, yet it lingered in her mind, like a shadow she couldn't shake. One night, Rowan met her at their usual spot and laid out a plan. It was simple. He claimed Thomas's evening jog took him along a deserted trail just outside town. "No one would even suspect you," Rowan said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "We'd do it together and it would be quick. He'd be out of your life and we could finally be together." Remy felt her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to say no, to run away, but instead she found herself nodding slowly, feeling as if she were watching herself from afar, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Rowan had a way of making her feel like she had no other choice. His words wrapped around her like a tight rope, pulling her closer to a decision that she knew was wrong. In the days that followed, Remy became even more unpredictable. She'd snap at Thomas over small things, her nerves frayed from the constant pressure. She felt her actions were no longer her own. It was as if Rowan's plan had taken over her entire life, leaving her feeling empty and afraid. She felt trapped in her own decisions, knowing each step was leading her further down a path she couldn't escape. The night of the plan arrived, and Remy felt like she was floating outside of herself, barely aware of what she was doing. She met Rowan on the dark, quiet path where Thomas would be jogging. Soon Rowan looked calm, even excited, as if this was just another adventure. He handed her a pair of gloves and whispered, "This is it, Remy. It's done, you'll be free." But as they waited, the weight of what they were about to do came crashing down on her. She looked at Rowan, realizing how little she really knew him, how twisted his love for her truly was. This wasn't love. This was obsession, a dangerous game that she was losing control of. Suddenly she felt a surge of desperation, a need to escape, to stop this before it went any further. Without thinking, she pulled off the gloves and backed away, shaking her head. "I can't do this, Rowan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't go through with it. This isn't right." Rowan's face darkened, his calm exterior shattering. "You can't back out now," he said, coldly, his voice sharp after everything. "You think you can just walk away?" He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding, and for the first time Remy saw the full extent of his control. She twisted out of his grip and ran, her heart racing, as she stumbled down the dark path away from Rowan, away from the life she'd been planning with him. She didn't stop until she was home, her breath coming in gasps as she locked the door behind her. In that moment, Remy knew she had to face the truth she had let herself fall into, a trap of her own making. But she wasn't willing to let it destroy her completely. She realized that her choices had led her here, but she still had a chance to put an end to the nightmare. She just had to find the courage to tell Thomas everything and start over, however painful that might be. That night, she sat alone in her room, waiting for Thomas to come home, ready to face the consequences of her actions and finally break free from the hold Rowan had on her. It wouldn't be easy, and she knew it could mean the end of everything she knew, but it was better than the darkness she had almost stepped into. Remy sat alone in the dark living room, her mind swirling with fear and regret. She had almost gone through with Rowan's plan to harm Thomas, but at the last moment she'd pulled back, realizing how wrong it all was. Her heart still pounded from the encounter with Rowan, who had turned from charming and exciting to controlling and frightening. She thought she had escaped, but she didn't know Rowan had followed her home. Furious that she'd backed out when Thomas finally came home from his late shift, he found Remy waiting for him, pale and tense. She had decided to confess everything: the affair, her plans with Rowan, and the terrible mistake she had nearly made. Thomas's face went from shock to anger to heartbreak as she poured out her story, each word hitting him like a punch. He didn't say a word until she was done, just staring at her in disbelief. But before he could respond, a loud banging sounded on the front door. They both froze. Thomas, still trying to make sense of Remy's confession, opened the door cautiously, and there stood Rowan, his face twisted with anger. "You thought you could just leave," he sneered, glaring at Remy. She felt trapped, realizing that Rowan wasn't about to let her walk away from their twisted plan so easily. He had followed her home, determined to finish what they had started one way or another. Thomas immediately understood who Rowan was and felt his own anger surges. "Oh, you're the one who's been sneaking around with my wife," he said, his voice tense. Rowan just smirked, taking a step closer. "She was never yours, Thomas. She was always mine." The air was thick with tension, and Remy could feel the weight of her choices crushing down on her. She watched as the two men faced off, each furious, each ready to explode. The argument quickly turned violent. Rowan lunged at Thomas, and the two began to fight, their anger boiling over into punches and shoves. Remy screamed, trying to pull them apart. Thanks for watching True Crime Cases.